Ladies and gentlemen, if we can kindly please take our seats. We are ready to commence. Thank you so very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm going to try again. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you so very much. A very, very warm welcome to the launch of the World Bank's 15th edition of the South Africa Economic Update. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it's just such a privilege to be able to serve you as the moderator of this morning's conversation. I've stepped away from the podium simply because even with my heels, I'm still a little challenged in terms of height, and I'd love for you to actually see me this morning. And so when we think about the conversation today, I think the title of the report is a great way to bring our focus. Anchored in learning, the report pulls our focus to the overdue reforms and emerging priorities in basic education. And so our conversation locates us at the relationship between education outcomes and economic growth. And to remind ourselves that the purpose of the report is to contribute to policy debate. And so this morning we're leaning into that invitation to have a conversation around our education policy and to step into that debate. And so it's such a pleasure that our Minister of Basic Education, Minister Sivir Kwagube, is here. I've been practicing as well, making sure that my Nguni tongue gets in the right place. We've also, of course, got the World Bank Country Director, Satu Kakonen, with us as well, and we'll be hearing from her. The team from the World Bank is standing by because they're going to be surfacing some of the key findings from the report so that we might engage with the content of the report. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to transition into a panel discussion where some of the leading experts in the education space are going to be sharing their own reactions and their own reflections on the report. My hope is that at that point we might also be able to open up the conversation so that your voices, your reactions, your reflections on the report might be integrated into the broader conversation. And so without further ado, mindful that the Minister has a tight schedule, and so she'll be sharing a keynote address with us this morning. And then shortly departing thereafter, I'd like to welcome the Honourable Minister to the podium. Let's give her a big round of applause as she shares her keynote. Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you.
A very good morning, everybody. Do I need to press it, or am I audible? A very good morning, everybody. The Program Director, Nozipho Shabalala. Very good morning. Country Director, Satu, esteemed panelists, esteemed colleagues, the MEC in the Western Cape, my colleague, David Mania. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. It is my absolute pleasure to join you today for the launch of the World Bank Economic Update, which is a critical resource in my view that helps us assess the very trajectory of our economy and informs the policy choices that we must make to achieve and drive sustainable growth. This report serves as an essential touchstone in our collective pursuit of economic development, and I want to extend my gratitude and my sincerest appreciation to the World Bank for the sterling work that they've done in compiling this report. It's very, very important for particularly policymakers, legislators, lawmakers in this space to be driven by data in their decision making. And so reports like these assist us in being able to say, this is what the data says, this is where we need to go, and it allows us to make really sound decisions, and for that we are truly grateful. For too long, ladies and gentlemen, and this is probably going to be something that I'm going to be echoing for many, many years, education has been viewed as a social investment, often confined within the boundaries of the social cluster of government. And while it has its very much a social value is undeniable, I want to challenge that in conventional thinking by saying we need to reframe education as an economic imperative, a fundamental driver of national growth, competitiveness, and productivity. Massive, massive parts of it, of course, have a social element to it, but in my view, we need to start looking at education slightly differently in a way that says this is part of our economic, the beginning of our economic strategy. Nations that have made this strategic change and long-term investments in the education system have reaped the benefits of sustained economic prosperity. We've seen in countries like South Korea and Singapore where investments in strong foundational education systems have enabled them to transition from developing economies to global powerhouses. And so their success shows that education is not just merely a social service, but it is a macroeconomic policy tool that can be used and must be embedded in our national economic strategy. So one day when I'm old and gray, hopefully we will start to see education moving from the social cluster, but more in the economic cluster, because then it would signify that the thinking around education and what it ought to do has effectively changed. And so I'm hoping that my petitioning here will essentially take root at some point. As South Africa, we must recognize that human capital development is central to our economic future. A well-educated, highly skilled workforce is an incredibly powerful tool that we have to drive economic growth in South Africa and reduce inequality. Our economy has not grown in satisfactory levels for far too long. For over a decade, we have been really sitting at less than 1% economic growth. And if we are going to change that, we're going to have to change the way in which we look at education and how we inject skills and excellence into the market. So we recently celebrated the success of the class of 2024 with a record number of learners achieving bachelor passes, meaning that over 355,000 young South Africans now have a clear pathway into higher education and degree studies. This is a milestone that is worth celebrating because it demonstrates that despite the many challenges our education system faces, we continue to improve access to quality education and expand opportunities for young people. However, these successes are important and they must not blind us. While these successes are important, we must not be blinded to the structural weaknesses that continue to hold us back and hold our education system back. The latest results from TIMSS, the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Studies, SACMEC, Southern and Eastern African Consortium for Monitoring Education Quality, and our very own homegrown South African systematic evaluation paint a concerning picture that should really, as people in this room who are concerned about our education system, should really be concerned about. These reports reveal that majority of South African learners who get to the age of 10 are unable to read for meaning in any language. And grade 5 learners consistently underperform against their global counterparts in maths and science, putting them at a disadvantage in a world increasingly driven by technological and scientific advancements. And so too many of our learners are progressing through school without mastering the foundational literacy and numeracy, which really affects and impacts their ability to succeed throughout their schooling career. And so these findings underscore a stark reality that we do not have strong foundational learning in South Africa. We have really worked hard over the past 31 years to make sure that we have access to education, sitting at 98% of all learners who are able to access education. But now we need to truly shift gear. And what do we mean by that? Now we need to start looking at how do we inject quality in the education that our learners have access to. And that has to begin with having a coherent education system that looks all the way from foundational learning right up until learners leave matric. Ours cannot be an education system that is stitched together by interventions when learners get to grade 10 and 12, grade 10, 11, and 12. We have to make sure that from the foundation phase, our learners are supported, because then the results take care of themselves by the time they get to grades of higher learning. And so this is why it's important that we're embarking on this strategic reorientation as the Department of Basic Education. One of the places that foundational learning, we want to place foundational learning at the center of education reform and on our agenda. And our strategy is simple, yet very transformative. Number one, we want to broaden access to early child learning. We want to ensure that every single child in South Africa has access to quality early learning opportunities before they enter grade R. Research has shown that the highest return on investment in education comes from investing in early years. Number two, we want to strengthen foundational phase learning. We're prioritizing teacher training, curriculum reforms, learning resources from grade R to 3, and ensuring that learners acquire strong literacy and numeracy skills. Number three, scaling up mother tongue-based bilingual education. Research does also show that children who learn in their home languages, particularly in the foundational phase, are able to be better at comprehension and cognitive development later in the years. This reorientation is not just about improving educational outcomes, but it is also ensuring that our education system is aligned with our economic objectives, so that we can produce a workforce that is globally competitive, innovative, and prepared for the jobs of the future. It could not be more important, and it could not be more urgent. And so it may sound simple, but in my view, if we are able to do these three things, we will be able to truly transform the way in which our education system performs and what we are able to do for our young learners who are going to be essentially entering schools now. Achieving this ambitious reform agenda requires collaboration because, colleagues, government cannot alone drive the necessary changes at the scale and at the pace that is required. We need strong partnerships in the private sector, development agencies, research institutions to support our efforts in these three key ways. Number one, investment in resources. We need partners that will support education infrastructure, teacher training, innovative learning programs, and enhance literacy and numeracy outcomes. Number two, systems support. Systems are incredibly important. You may have resources, you may have the money, but if you don't have the correct systems in place, you are likely going to fail. And so system support becomes important. The mass registration and formalization of ECD centers across the country is an urgent priority, and we need expertise and technical support to make sure that this process is efficient, effective, and transparent. Number three, research and advocacy and advisory support. Reports such as this World Bank Economic Update are incredibly invaluable in helping us understand where we need to make our focus and where we need to make sure that our efforts are and resources are allocated. They also help us make an argument that is backed by research that also says, as policymakers, as lawmakers, this is what guides the decisions that we make, as I indicated right at the beginning. To institutionalize evidence decision-making, I have decided that I will be establishing the National Education and Training Council, an advisory body that will work very closely with government to provide strategic insights and recommendations on key education policies. One of the priorities of the NETC will be to be reviewing the funding model of public schools, ensuring that education financing is equitable, it is sustainable, and it is aligned with the needs of the sector. The recommendations made in this World Bank Economic Update about the reforming of the quintile funding model, as well as other recommendations, will be submitted to the Advisory Council for consideration, allowing us to integrate global best practices into our own decision-making processes. I take very seriously the warning that the World Bank report makes concerning the increasing financial constraints of the state. We are aware of the pressures that are experienced by provincial education departments as they planned to start the year of 2025. In these economic times described in the update report launched today, it is necessary that every single cent available for education is spent in ways which benefits maximum learners, educators, and others involved in the planning and the delivery of our education system. Since assuming our responsibilities in July last year, the Deputy Minister and I have started to look critically at how we spend our precious resources. These must be spent with a clear and a sharp focus on our mandates and relevance of our programs and activities. The same must apply to public-private partnerships so that we may be able to obtain maximum benefit from the generosity of many of our supporters and our partners. There must be no wastage. We cannot spend anybody's money, whether it is public money or private money, recklessly. The need is great in our system. Therefore, that's why we need systems in place so that resources can be allocated where the greatest need is. And so I know that I have the full support of those who are concerned in this matter. Before I conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to extend an invitation to many partners in this room to join us on the upcoming Banapele ECD Roadmap Summit, which is scheduled for the 17th of March 2025. This summit serves as a turning point in shaping the future of early child learning in South Africa, and your insights and contributions will be critical in ensuring that we develop a roadmap that is implementable, that is impactful, that is aligned with global standards, but critically, that has timelines, so that we can make sure that we are constantly accountable to the things that we said we're going to do. Too often in government, we have incredible plans that are great to look at, but very few times are we able to hold ourselves to a standard that says, here are the timelines, this is how much it will cost us to get there, this is the roadmap, hold us accountable in exactly a year's time when we said we were going to do what we're going to do. And so I'm absolutely committed to walking out of that summit saying, this is the roadmap, these are the timelines, and in a year's time, hold us accountable to that work. Because of course, as I said, reorientating the system towards foundational learning is absolutely critical. And so the task before us is urgent and is clear. We must move beyond seeing education as just another social program. It is an economic necessity, a tool for national development, and the foundation upon which South Africa's future prosperity is built and will be built. We have bold ambitions for this sector, and we must be relentless in our pursuit for educational excellence. Let us seize this moment, work together, use the kind of data that is before us to ensure that every child in South Africa receives quality education and the quality education that they deserve. Anything less would be an absolute disservice to the millions of children who look to us as leaders, as policymakers, as lawmakers to change their lot in life. And that for me becomes the moral imperative of why we need to get this right. Diabulela, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. I'm going to ask the Minister to please just join us in the front for a photo opportunity. Minister, if I can kindly ask you to please join us for a photo opportunity. Satu, can I ask you to join us here as well so that we can just capture this moment? May I ask the presenters of the report, Liz and Jacques, if you can join us in the photograph? And finally, might I please also ask the panelists who are going to be participating, Prof. Sachs, if I can ask you, Yana, Permi, I think you're all here. And thank you, Lavinia. We're going to ask you to take, and MEC, please, can I kindly ask, call on the MEC to please join us. MEC, thank you very much for being here. And we're going to have copies of the report in all of your hands. If we're going to get a few more coming through so that we can really make this count. All right, does everybody have a copy? Fabulous. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, can we give our minister a very warm round of applause, please? Minister, thank you so much for reminding us of the why, the moral imperative that brings us into this room and into this conversation, for highlighting the value of reports such as these, and in particular, their ability to give us the data that allows for informed decisions and informed policy making, for acknowledging the successes but also not shying away from the structural weaknesses that still exist, but also a very clear call to action. If indeed we are going to lead with Bana Pili, children first, what needs to be true? And what we've heard from you is partnerships, it's smart spending, it's no wastage, amongst many others, but also accountability is what we've heard from you. Thank you very much, Minister. I think you've set the tone for the conversation this morning. I know we've started with a big bang with the keynote, and now we're going to transition to an opening remark, but always well. And so it's my absolute pleasure to welcome the World Bank Country Director looking after South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and the Kingdom of Eswatini. Let's please give Satu Kakonen a big round of applause as she comes up. Thank you, Satu.
Honorable Sivive Kwarube, I hope I didn't butcher your name, the Minister of Basic Education. Honorable Fumzile Mlando Gezuka, that's a difficult name for me. I don't know if I butchered that, but former Deputy President. Honorable David Maynier, Minister of Education for the Western Cape Province. Esteemed guests from the government, academia, education sector, business, and development partners. All protocols observed. Good morning and warm welcome on behalf of the World Bank to the launch of the 15th edition of the South Africa Economic Update. I'm very grateful for the Minister of Basic Education opening this event and inspiring all of us and giving basically a very encouraging and promising picture where the basic education sector in South Africa is trying to move. I'm very delighted to be with you here this morning, and I'm very happy that we are doing this launch jointly with the Department of Basic Education and with two ministers in the room. As the previous editions of the economic updates, this report provides first an update on the state of the economy, and our special focus topic this year is, shouldn't be a surprise anymore to anybody, is basic education. Now, let's start with the state of economy. Regarding the state of economy, the good news is that South Africa is back on a positive growth path. This was thanks to the successful and peaceful political transition after elections, the suspension of the most extreme load shedding, and the control of inflation. GDP is expected to increase from an estimated 0.8% in the past year to 1.88% in 2025, and thereafter over the medium term to 2%. If achieved, the growth rate of 2% would be almost 3 times higher than the average of the past decade. So it's an achievement. If basically that materializes. But 2% growth would not be enough to achieve the fast and inclusive growth that President Ramaphosa envisions for the country. It would take about 60 years for South Africa to become a high-income country if the economy continued to grow at 2%. And most worrisomely, existing high level of poverty and inequality would not change significantly. So 2% is good, but it's not good enough. South Africa would need to grow in the range of 3 to 5% to see a change and significant job creation. There are several options for South Africa to accelerate the growth to that range. And all these options require continued and stepped up reforms. My colleague, Jacques, will describe these options in greater detail in a short while. But it is important to note that in all these options, strengthening human capital through improved education is a core component. So education matters and matters a lot. The reason education is so fundamental, the Honourable Minister emphasized that education is not a social issue, it's an economic issue, and we completely agree with that. Why is it so fundamental for economic prosperity? Is that in tomorrow's world, the winners will be those who possess the skills and knowledge to innovate and adapt to rapid technological change. And those skills and knowledge can only be built out on a strong foundation of quality education acquired in early years. This is also what the Honourable Minister emphasized. Children who are proficient in reading and mathematics in early grades are most likely to continue acquiring skills at a faster pace than those who do not have the foundation in those areas. And in recent history, countries who have best managed economic transformations are those that have developed skilled workforce through efficient and effective education. This has allowed them to attract investments from innovative industries and also create productive jobs for their people. That's very important, and in particular important for South Africa, that has the highest unemployment rate in the world. However, South Africa has a learning crisis. Despite significant progress since the early 2000s, learning outcomes are very low compared to other middle-income countries across the world, and given the high level of public spending and private spending on education. As Honourable Minister said, about 80% of 10-year-olds today are unable to fully understand what they are reading. This is extremely worrisome. And there are significant disparities in learning outcomes, more so than in other countries in the world. And these disparities depend not only on families' income, but they also depend on teaching practices in the classroom. Now, the good news is that this crisis can be turned around if determined action is taken. And we heard Honourable Minister saying that there is now determination to take the determined action. Evidence from other countries and also from South Africa indicates that the turnaround would above all require improved foundational learning in reading and mathematics. That would require scaling up access to quality early childhood development services and national early grade reading and mathematics interventions for children in grade R3. Now, Honourable Minister already alluded to that there is also a pressure to expand the education system to accommodate more than 1 million additional learners by 2030. The government of South Africa already spends a large share of the budget on education, higher compared to other upper middle income countries. And there's little fiscal space to increase the education budget in real terms, given slow growth and other burning priorities. So in such a difficult situation, it would be critical to improve the efficiency of spending on education. That is, it is critical to spend better. And also, it is critical to partner with private providers and other providers to improve access to quality education for all children, especially in the poorest communities. So in conclusion, we hope that this economic update will contribute to the debate on how South Africa can achieve its development goals and overcome the learning crisis. The World Bank stands ready to support South Africa's continued efforts to achieve faster and more inclusive growth, and also addressing the learning crisis that the country is facing today. Thank you very much. Enjoy the event.
Satu, thank you very much for bringing into the conversation some of the numbers that really pull our focus to the urgency of the job at hand. A growth rate of 0.8%, projected to potentially reach 1.8% and maybe get to 2%. And even if we achieve all of that, it is still not enough. The reality that Satu reminds us is we are expecting at least a minimum of 1 million children to also be accommodated into the system. So what needs to change and what needs to be done? And with that question, I'm going to transition us then to the presentation of the key findings of the report. The World Bank team is going to be led in this regard by Elizabeth Neenan. She's a program leader looking after human development, as well as Jacques Morissette, who is a program leader and the lead economist within the team. And as Satu has indicated, the report being in two parts, we're going to hear a two-part conversation as they land the story of what sits on the pages of this economic update. Might I ask us to please give them a warm round of applause as they come up onto the stage. Yes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Will determine its economy, will also determine the society and where South Africa will be as a nation in the years to come. But education and learning doesn't happen out of a context. You need to understand where the jobs will be created, what will be the money available to finance the education system. You need to understand the context in order to develop an efficient and affordable education system. So that's what I'm going to try to do, give you the context. I will not try to summarize all the key messages of the first part of this report, but more to give you a teaser, and hopefully you will then jump into the report and read it carefully. And so it's more like a teaser. I will try to be quick because I want to give the most space possible for the debate about education. But let me what I will try to do is to be quick on what you know, what has been said a few times, that the economy is on a road of recovery. I will certainly discuss a bit more what you should know, that it's not enough for South Africa to achieve inclusive growth, particularly to create jobs for the population. And then I will spend a bit more time what you maybe don't know, but what could do South Africa to get to this 5% economic growth that everybody is speaking about. So let me start with what you should know, and South Africa is on the road to recovery, and that's our expectations. You can see that the growth rate is projecting toward 2% in the next 2 or 3 years. It is 0.8% in 2024. We expect to get to 1.8% in 2025, 1.9% in 2026, and 2% 2027. But it's 3 times average that South Africa grew over the past decade. But what is important as well, it's based on some assumptions, and I want to emphasize some of these assumptions because it's still a fragile baseline. First, I will start with the bottom, that you need to believe in a stable external environment, which these days might be a very, very strong assumptions. If we were speaking yesterday, maybe I would not say exactly the same about the external environment. What I'm saying is news are changing a lot, and it's difficult to predict exactly what will be the external environment. I'm talking not only about the economic and political environment, but as well the climate change. Last year, the economy of South Africa is estimated to grow below 1%, and mainly because you had a huge shock on the agricultural sector in the third quarter of 2024. So you need as well to expect no big climate shock in the years to come in South Africa. I want to emphasize that it's both economic, political, as well the climate environment, which will matter. But certainly the most important assumptions are domestic. You still need to believe that politically the country will be stable. You believe that the reforms, and I will come back on it, on the solutions for tomorrow, that the reforms in the infrastructure sectors will produce some positive impact on the economy. Inflation will be in control. I will come back as well. The government and national treasury will be able to achieve fiscal consolidation without compromising the delivery of basic services and infrastructure, and all of that is quite important. It shows that it's possible, but still it is a fragile environment that doesn't apply only to South Africa, but as well it applies for South Africa for specific reasons. But I believe you know about it. So let me go to the next question, which is what you should know. What you should know is that this 2% that we're predicting over the next few years might be not enough, and it was well said by my director, Satu. It's not enough. It's not enough if compared to what the World Bank project for other middle-income countries. Actually, 2% is only half of the growth expected for other middle-income countries in the next 3 years. So South Africa, even with 2%, will be underperforming its peers. That's the first comparison. We know as well that, and there's been quite a lot of studies over the past decade showing that if you want to achieve inclusive growth, and most of the cases are looking East Asia, that you need to grow at both 5% or 7% per year on a long period of time. That's the Malaysian example, that's the Vietnam example, and that's the China example. So you need to get much more than 2% to achieve significant reduction in poverty and to create jobs. As mentioned before, 60 years for South Africa at 2% per year growth to reach the high income level. That's a long time to get what you want to be. I would like to emphasize the last point, that with 1% growth, the economy, and of course it's looking backwards, will create not too many jobs actually. The elasticity, the response of employment to GDP growth in South Africa is very low. It's very low because you are an economy relying on poorly labor-intensive sectors like mining and utilities. So if you grow by 1% more, you will create maybe 30,000 to 50,000 jobs. That's not enough. So you need to grow faster. I don't want to expand on it, but as well you have some distortions in labor and capital markets, which also encourage firms to use more capital or technologies than labor. But I will stop there as well. My message is that growth might be not enough to create the employments that South Africa is looking for. But you should know about it. So let me go where I believe maybe where is the most value added of the first part of the report is what can be done to get to the target of 5 or more 5% more GDP growth per year. So if you look in the last 2-3 decades, you have only one short episode of time in the history of South Africa where the economy grew more than 5%. That's the mid-2000s, where the economy grew faster. But South Africa got quite lucky. It's not only luck, but we're lucky because commodity prices were very high and you're still an exporting countries of commodities. And that's explained a lot of the high growth in the mid-2000s. So you can be lucky again, who knows? But as well, you have your future in your hands, and we're proposing 3 actions, which actually are not new, are relatively well known, and actually the government has already implemented some of the actions. But let me quickly share those options with you, or those actions. We're talking about 3 possible actions. It's a selection, so we're not saying that that's exhaustive, but we believe that those 3 actions are a necessary platform to get where South Africa wants to be. The first one is addressing infrastructure constraints. The second one is improving fiscal efficiency. And the third one, which is clearly the topic of today, strengthening human capital development. Let me go quickly on each of them. For each of the slides, I'm just telling you the structure because you can read it, and I will not describe each of the slides. You have the why this constraint is important, what to do, what we advocate, the actions we could be undertaken by the government, and what is the expected impact. On each of the slides, I will mainly focus on the expected impact because I believe that's where it can motivate you and policymakers to take action. But let me go on the first one a little bit more in details, and I will be quicker for the others. Addressing financing constraint, infrastructure constraint. I think I don't have to make the case. You know that if you don't have electricity, if you don't have water, if you don't have transport, you're not able to grow. It's true for businesses, but it's also true for households. And the worst part of it, it's quite unequal. If you have money, you're certainly more able to cope with those constraints than if you don't have money. So it goes against growth, but also against inclusive growth and the reduction of poverty. What you can do, of course, do what you're doing in energy. I mean, it's quite spectacular what the government and the country has been able to do with load shedding. I know it came back over the weekend, but still, I mean, I was here in 2023, and the change between 2023 and today is amazing. My point is that do what you did very well 10, 15 years ago. South Africa doesn't need to look at what others have been doing. I'm giving you 2 examples, civil aviation and telecommunication. You have been able to provide competition to these 2 sectors, and look at where South Africa is today. It's certainly the best in telecommunication and civilization in the continent. You cannot say the same for other infrastructure services. Impact. So what is the impact? We know a lot what is the negative side of not having infrastructure. The central bank herself have been estimating 3-4% decline in GDP growth in 2023 because of energy and transport constraint or bottlenecks. If the government implementing the reforms, you can create 250,000 jobs in 2 or 3 years, or you can create in 5 years' time 500,000 jobs. Direct and direct jobs. I'm not going to expand on the modeling of it, but that's something, and we might be wrong, but to give you another magnitude, remember the elasticity, the response of employment to GDP growth in South Africa is very low. One way to promote it is to remove constraint to infrastructure. Let me move to the second one. It's very important because you know that the country has not much fiscal space to work with. The government, NT projections will be reducing the deficit, which means to some extent you will reduce expenditures. except if you're able to get more revenues. But the projections are expenditures will certainly go up, and it's a big topic for education, as mentioned before. Efficiency is important. You will find in the report quite a few examples where we believe the government could be more efficient. I give you one example, and I'm looking at my colleague Liz. You have more than 100 active training programs in South Africa. We had the visit of the former minister of Chile of economy, and he was saying it's 99 too many. The point is that you have duplication, you have fragmentation, and you can achieve huge efficiency gains if you coordinate and you select your program. It does apply with labor program, but it does apply to other sectors of the economy, and you will find some examples. It's also very important to push for more digitalizations. It's also very important to push for e-procurement. You have cross-cutting reforms in the government we can produce, and we know it because other countries have done it, can produce huge efficiency gains. I'm just going with the impact. And maybe I will be a little bit provocative with my example, which is the second one. Today, South Africa is spending about 4% of GDP on social protection. It's warranted, of course. But it's one of the highest amount of money spent in a budget by a country. My point is, if this money was targeted to the all extreme poor in South Africa, and we're talking about more than 10 million people, if this money was given to the extreme poor, you will eradicate extreme poverty. My message is not to tell you you can do that, but my message is South Africa has the money to eradicate extreme poverty today. And not too many countries in the world, I would say no countries in Africa has the money to eradicate extreme poverty today. South Africa has it. Let me go with the third policy actions that we detail in the first part of the report, and it is a transition to the second part. It is about human capital. If you look in the graph, it shows that South Africa is underperforming in terms of human capital development, and we're using the World Bank indicators compared to many other countries. You should be above, the trend, the line, the 45 degrees line, and you're below it. And actually, you're very much below it. It means that South Africa is quite inefficient in terms of human capital development. We did as well some comparisons in terms of resources spent by South Africa and the outcomes in terms of social development, in terms of human development. You find the same result. South Africa is spending not too much, but spending a lot of money for relatively low outcomes. So more needs to be done. And what needs to be done, most of the differences across countries in terms of human capital development are explained by the education system. Basically, they're explained by health and education, but 2/3 of the explanation is coming from education. That's why the topic of education, and the minister emphasized it very well, it's an economic challenge as well. So that's very important to say. I'm finishing this first part by, there are some studies showing that investing in human capital in South Africa is the single largest contributor to productivity growth. It's important because without productivity, you're not achieving good growth. And if you're investing in human capital, you will get more than others. Of course, you need a little bit better institutions, you need more physical capital, you need more innovation, but the result shows that human capital will make the difference. Everything needs to go together, but without human capital, South Africa will not achieve productivity growth and will not achieve its goal to become an economic economy without poverty in the years to come. So I stop here, and I will give the floor to my colleague Liz, who will speak about the second part of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques, and good morning, everybody. So as Jacques said, I'm going to be focusing on the second part of the report, which is on basic education. And I want to give you two messages during this this part of the presentation. One is that there are overdue reforms in the education space, particularly related to foundational learning, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And the second is that there is a tight fiscal environment and budgets in real terms are going down for education. So the question is, how is the education system going to respond with tight budgets, declining in real terms for the education sector, while the number of kids that are entering the system is growing? And I'm going to be talking about those two issues in this presentation. So when we talk about learning levels, we've all heard the statistics around children not being able to read simple text for meaning by the time they're in grade 4. But what does that kind of look like? And I wanted to share a slide that my friend Nick had put together a while ago, but I think it demonstrates really nicely what it means when we say a child is not reading for meaning by the time they're in grade 4. And we think about this in terms of the pace at which a child is reading. So there's now benchmarks that have been set by the Department of Basic Education around how many words a child needs to be reading correctly at different grade levels. So by grade 5, a child should be reading about 80 words correctly per minute. This is in English. By the time they're in grade 5, they've transitioned out of local language into English. And then we're going to do a comparison from a study that was done in 2015 around grade 5 learners, 40% of grade 5 learners who only read less than 40 words correctly per minute. And this is what it looks like. Okay, so the child in the rural area reading with those yellow words, they're not able to see the letters probably, sound out the letters, and be able to see how letters blend together to make words, and then be able to pick it up at a pace that they can understand the sentence. So if you're not reading at the pace that's required, you're not going to understand what you're reading. So that's the challenge, right? And South Africa, the report acknowledges this, has made tremendous progress since the early 2000s on learning. But that progress has started to stagnate. And by 2016, we start to see that stagnation in different international reading assessments. And still today, we're at 81% of grade 4 learners who can't read a simple text. But we do know what to do in terms of how to improve learning levels, right? Not just from Brazil or the US or India or Kenya. We know from South African experience and different pilots done at a small to medium scale around what to do to improve learning. So this report was produced by multiple different people who are contributing to this. Many of you were reviewers of this report, but my co-author Luis Crouch, who is based in the US, I'm going to be playing a video from him and asking him the questions of what does it take to improve reading levels.
Yes, there is definitely a science of reading. There are scientific journals devoted to this that gather evidence statistically, experimentally, from the field, from schools. But it's really more of a mix of sciences, all the way from neuroscience, the science of the brain, to psychology, all the way to actually archaeology and paleontology, that establish that reading is not as natural as speaking. Speaking is built into our genes. Reading is not. Reading has to be taught, has to be explicitly taught in the classroom or outside the classroom until it becomes as automatic as speaking. But reaching that automaticity takes a lot of practice and a lot of teaching, a lot of instruction. Yeah, there has been developed a set of interventions that have now been tried in quite a few countries, Brazil, Kenya, India, and they are actually distilled down to something as simple as what we call the 5 T's. One T is teaching, the art of teaching reading. Another T is text. The kids have to have something to read to actually practice their reading. Another one is time. There has to be time in the daily routine of the classroom, time devoted to the teaching of reading, not just language arts, but reading as a mechanical process. There is another T is for testing. You have to find some way of testing whether the kids are learning or not. And all these 5 T's are actually spelled out in the World Bank report that this video is accompanying. Yeah, I would say that South Africa is ready to implement at scale because the skills to provide all these things, the 5 T's, the textbooks, the teaching approaches, the lesson plans, the testing, to do that in an integrated way, those skills have been developed. Now, they've been developed in a pilot context. They now need to be taken to scale. And that takes quite a bit of managerial know-how and getting everybody in the ministry or the department, as it were, to work together to deliver these things up and down the system, all the way down from the department, all the way down to the school, through the district offices and so on, in what I call the zippered up way. And this is doable. Other countries have done it. South Africa can do it. And if South Africa does deliver these things in an integrated way, the kids will be reading much better, and it can be done in a matter of a few years. It doesn't take 20 years. So South Africa is ready, and if they do implement these things in an integrated way, it's almost guaranteed that the kids will be reading much better in a matter of a couple of years.
All right, so I want to move to what Luis called in his video the zippered up delivery of services, right, and interventions. And over here we're referring to a report that was done a few years ago where we tried to document the different interventions targeting different parts of these 5 T's. Some of them do everything, some of them do parts of it, and some of them have been rigorously evaluated and others have not. But there is already a body of evidence in South Africa implemented over the last 20 years that can be drawn on. And how do we take all of these lessons of what we've learned and how do we scale that and how do we build it into the institutional delivery? Honorable Minister talked about systems that can then deliver these services and interventions, and how does it come together at the classroom level? We can talk about workbooks on one side, we can talk about training of teachers on the other side, we can talk about testing in one way, but it does need to come together, and the teachers need to be really bringing that together in the classroom, supported by leaders in the school. So thinking about taking that to scale, and this is where we call it the overdue reform. I think South Africa has been learning about these interventions, not just from the country, but from other places, and really thinking about how it moves to scale, how you use the data better, and how you can measure learning more systematically. When we were writing the report, the new South Africa Systemic Evaluation results had not come out yet. There is now what's called a SASE evaluation report. It is an assessment that's done of learning levels, but that report came out in 2024 based on 2022 results. So how do you get a system in place where you're measuring learning effectively, quickly, and providing feedback to teachers, to schools, in order to make the changes and the interventions to come into the classroom and deliver better learning. And we think about this, as Jacques was saying, around multiple interventions and how they could be consolidated, but then thinking about what works and scaling it up. And you can think about this in other subsectors of education as well. The ECD space is another space where you have multiple parenting programs that are out there, through different departments, but not necessarily having the type of coordination that's required in order to think about the scale that you need to get to. So just wrapping up this section on learning, we really come out with 3 priority actions. So focus on the 5 T's. So focus on the pedagogy, focus on the teaching in classroom, and then the second part being measuring learning against benchmarks. So maybe you don't need to do these massive, learning assessments, which are across grades and a census-based system. You do need to check on learning assessments, take the temperature of where things are, but you could do something which the DBE is developing currently, which is learning benchmarks. And I really like the way they've done these benchmarks in all the official languages in South Africa, where you have benchmarks around at the end of grade 1 in Nguni languages, a child needs to be able to sound out letters, 40 letters correctly. And in grade 2, they need to be able to read 20 words correctly, and so on it goes. This is quite easy for any stakeholder to really understand and everybody to get behind. If you had teachers behind it, if you had parents behind it, and school leaders behind it. These benchmarks are already developed and trying to roll them out in South Africa so everybody in schools knows what needs to be done and we can head towards that target and push for improvements to meet those targets. And then the third part of it, we go into quite a lot of detail in the report on this, but the other reports on ECD, there's the government's own strategy to improve access to and the quality of ECD services. Again, as I mentioned, multiple departments involved, but ECD is really the foundation of preparing children to be able to learn when they get into the primary schools. And this is particularly important for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So these 3 aspects are really the combination of interventions that we think are the overdue reforms in foundational learning. So I'm going to move over to the next section, which I talked about in this part of the presentation, which is around this emerging issue around decline in education budget in real terms, while there's still an increase in the number of students that are coming into the system. As Jacques and Satu mentioned, South Africa does prioritize education. So as a percentage of GDP, if you look at both basic education and higher education, the government is spending 6.1% of GDP on basic and higher education. That compares to about 4% that other upper middle income countries are spending. But other upper middle income countries don't have the levels of inequality that South Africa does. And if you compare South Africa to a place like Brazil or Botswana that has similar levels of inequality, it's about the same in terms of how much they're spending. Botswana actually spends more. And this over here, you'll see this is just for basic education and some comparisons to other countries. So what are the options? You're spending a lot on education. You have to spend more than the average upper middle income country given the inequality levels. But even when you account for inequality, the learning levels are lower than where it should be compared to a country like Brazil, for example. And so we have declining budgets in real terms. You see from 2019-2020, 338 billion rand spent on basic education. And that decline now is now down to the projection for 2024-25 is 323 billion. It was 333 billion in 2023. So 5 billion rand decline in real terms over 5 years. And in that time, you had about 400,000 students entering the basic education. So it's a real challenge, and provinces are reacting to that challenge. Some provinces have said they're going to cut teacher posts because they can't afford to keep those teachers in the system. Other provinces have said that they're not what have said or declared, but we've seen this through the data that they're providing less per learner in terms of the minimum allocation that is provided to schools for each learner. by the department. But in South Africa, the quality management system, which is a bureaucratic accountability system in South Africa, it's a system where there's not really very many consequences for underperformance, because you're going to be assessed in a classroom or in a school or by inspectors, but your salary wages are negotiated at the central level. So they negotiate by public service and national treasury, and everybody's going to get the standard. So bureaucratic accountability is not working as well as it could. Professional accountability, and you can think about professional accountability in the sense of professional bodies. You know, you can think about medical fraternity or legal fraternity, and professional accountability means requires you to acquire specialized skills, to pass certification examination, and uphold professional standards. And teacher professional standards are really around two different areas. Initial teacher education, standards for what it takes to be trained as a teacher, and then the second is standards of what it means to be when you're in the classroom. What are the standards you need to uphold? And we are trying to, in the report, we make a case that because you have this imminent retiring, how do you make sure that the new cadre of teachers coming into the system come into the system adequately trained and supported at the standards that are required? So really trying to push on professional accountability to get better value from teachers in the system. Okay, what about two more? So you made the three. So resources could be more equitably allocated in the system as well. This is a way also to get better outputs, right? Remember, efficiency is about what you're putting in terms of funding and how what results you're getting. And we know that by making sure that resources are equitably well allocated, that you can get better results. And in South Africa, the system, and I think all of you know this over here, we have a quintile system for schools where schools are classified in quintiles. Quintile 1 to 3 schools are serving learners coming from low-income households, so they go to school with no fees. Quintile 4 to 5 schools are ones that are serving wealthier households, and there they do pay fees. But what we see, and this is some analysis we did in one province in South Africa, and I hope that the department can take this forward and do this in other provinces as well. But what we wanted to look at is what is the spending per learner in this one province, looking at it by quintiles, right? So are we spending the same for a child? Is public spending for a child in quintile 1 to 3 school look the same as public spending for quintile 4 to 5 child? Because it probably shouldn't be. It should be that we're spending more on children who are coming from lower income. The first thing we noticed is that in a lot of provinces, and this is not just true with this province that we were looking at, that quintile systems is not necessarily working as it should. A lot of provinces are saying that quintile 4 schools are serving some of the poorer communities and are saying that they need to reclassify them as no-fee schools. So about 70% of quintile 4 schools are classified as no-fee schools, and about 14% of quintile 5 schools are no-fee schools. So provinces are making the decision that the quintile system needs to be re-looked at, and that's one thing that we are suggesting in the report as well. But let's go to the per student spending. Per student spending should be, on average, it's about 25,000 rand per child in South Africa, right? That's on average. Over here, if you look at the spending, and we've broken it down on teacher wages, you can see how much is spent per learner that comprises of teacher wages. And you'll see that if you look at primary education, the spending on teacher wages, whether it's in quintile 1 to 3 or quintile 4 and 5, is about the same. When you go to secondary education, you actually see that spending is more on quintile 5 teachers, probably because teachers are more the packages that teachers get in quintile 5 schools are probably better. And they're probably also able to attract better teachers in terms of qualifications and experience to go into quintile 5 schools. So you already see some disparities there. And then we come to the funding that I mentioned, which is around the recurrent non-wage spending. So this is the spending per learner. And here you do see some bias, obviously, because the norms and standards are set, right? A child who's going to a quintile 1 to 3 school is receiving 1,600 Rand per learner, and that's about half the amount for quintile 4, and it's about a sixth of the amount. So it's trying to equalize some of that disparity and making sure that those in quintile 1 to 3 are actually getting more of the funding, and that happens within that orange bar, but that amount is so small compared to the 75% of the budget that's spent on teachers. So the basic point being over here is that it is your allocation of teachers and how teachers are deployed to school that's going to drive the equity in resources. And how do we make sure that resources that are coming into the system, that the best resources are going into the quintile 1 to 3 schools. When you add over here the amount that quintile 5 schools get in terms of school fees, you actually see that quintile 5 schools are getting over 47% more in total funding, right? That's compared to the quintile 1 to 3 schools. When you look at just public spending, it's about the same. In secondary schools, public spending is about 5% higher in quintile 1 to 3 schools versus quintile 4 to 5. So I'm not going to go through this in more detail, but there's a lot of detail right up in the report. But it's an important issue to think about when we think about equity in allocation of resources to schools. So the report really asks these questions, right? These are emerging priorities. So where does the classification of the quintile system go? Should we be re-looking at the norms and standards for school funding? How can the system direct better teaching resources towards poorer performing learners? All right, so I'm wrapping up over here. So the first part of the report in terms of actions really focuses on strengthening learning outcomes, and the second around thinking about different models and options of engaging with the private sector, and the third is around improving efficiency and equity of learners. These are presented as separate options, but they really are interdependent on each other. And these options, if looked at comprehensively, can improve learning. And there is a real issue that we have to balance over here around the issue around declining resources going towards the education sector, but also to be able to improve the efficiency of the system and accountability of the system in order to be able to then in the future, private providers and National Treasury, once things turn around, will be more willing, hopefully, to be providing additional resources to the system because there's better accountability and better value for money that is being spent in the education sector. Thank you very much.
A very big thank you to Liz and Jacques for really spelling out and surfacing some of the insights in the report. And I think what they've done is, of course, created the space for our panelists to really step in, to react and to reflect on some of the recommendations that they've shared that are, of course, inherent in the report. I'm going to invite my panelists now onto the stage to come in and weigh in on this report. I'm going to point out that there is a step on this side of the room as well. So as I call Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, can we give her a round of applause as she comes up to take her seat as well? She joins us, of course, in her capacity as the chair of the 2030 Reading Panel, but, of course, for us, knowing that she is the former Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa and former Executive Director of UN Women as well. Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka, if I might invite you to take the seat closest to the podium. Joining Dr. Mlambo Ngcuka is Professor Michael Sachs. As he comes up, he is an adjunct professor at the University of the Witwatersrand and former head of National Treasury's Budget Office, so I'm sure he has some thoughts on the efficiency of spending as well. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so much, Michael. And I believe Michael also part of the panelists that make up the reading panel. So there's a relationship on our stage already. Allow me to welcome Jana Duploy. Jana is the founding CEO of Apex Education. And to the point that Liz was making, they are in the business of making high quality education to children in low income communities possible. Jana, thank you for being here. Let's give her a round of applause as she takes her seat. And we're going to complete the panel by inviting Permi Isaac. She is the head of content training at Funda Wande. If we saw a list of some of those projects that Liz was advocating for their expansion, Funda Wande was definitely on that list against 2021, and they are in the business of equipping teachers to teach reading for meaning, as well as calculating with confidence. So we're really focusing on both the literacy and the numeracy. Our time is a bit tight, so I'm going to take my seat and very quickly get to the heart of the matter so we can see whether we can take one or two questions from the floor.
You should be sitting here. You should be sitting here.
Dr. Mlambo Ngcuka, let me just start off with you right at the end. We've heard a lot in the conversations and in the presentations from the team that more needs to be done to strengthen literacy and numeracy programs. But one of the key questions is a question of scale. In your view, how do we scale early grade interventions that we're seeing are successful, that are pointing us in the right direction, so that we don't have a list of different programs, but a few programs that are well funded and doing really well?
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Well, really, the size of the problem is such that scaling up is most necessary. And we have to look at the problem at the beginning up to the end so that we're able to cover every child, starting from teacher training, so that pre-service interventions ensures that every teacher who comes into the system is already ready to hit the ground running. At the reading panel, we have already been talking to universities about reviewing the degrees that are offered to teachers who will be teaching at the foundation level. We need to standardize these interventions, because my sense is that different universities are doing something, but they're doing something, each university is doing something different. Yeah. There isn't a guarantee that every teacher who goes into foundation phase at least knows ABC. Yeah. You just get a pitch-potch. So that's one thing, standardization, so that you are assured that every teacher who's coming into the school system has a level of training that is relevant for the schools. But also the lecturers who teach those teachers themselves have been struggling with teaching the teachers to teach literacy in the schools. So that too has to be taken care of across the universities. And then of course, what happens when the teachers are at the schools themselves, the supports that they need, the workbooks that they require. And that is something that has to come from the national department, so that you are assured that every school in the country gets it. Right now we've got boutique initiatives, and not everybody gets the same, and there are cases where some schools and some teachers get nothing at all. So standardization is really quite critical for us to get the scale and to ensure that we cover every child in the country.
So what I'm hearing you say, Dr. Mlabunguka, is that it's a look at the whole value chain, starting right at the beginning with teacher training, but then being very clear about the standardization of how we get teachers ready for the classroom. Let me do a quick follow-up. If we hear from, I think Satu raised it for us earlier, she said, the invitation is so clear. Let's get all children reading for meaning by the age of 10. How do we get all stakeholders involved? Not just stakeholders that are in the form of teachers, but how do we get the private sector involved? How do we get other stakeholders so that we all are aligned around a single vision of every child can read for meaning by age of 10?
I'll go back again to national education, which can reach all of us.
Yeah.
I think it's important that there's some clarity from them about what is needed so that this problem is owned by somebody who can give us guidance. Because right now, I think there's too many of us who are talking on this subject, and there's a potential that we are fragmenting the message. So we really need to tighten it up. It's a good thing that now the Minister of Education has listed her priorities, and this is one of her priorities, thankfully.
Yes.
And that is helping us to all focus in the same thing. Recently, we had a meeting of deans of education for all the universities, plus the ministries, for the first time ever. And it was the DBE and the Department of Higher Education. And it was very meaningful because we talked about what should happen at the universities, what should happen in the schools, and what should the deans understand, because the feeling was that the deans don't necessarily always know what is actually happening where they have a responsibility, because this is a bit far removed from them. And this was put right on their table to say, this is what the country needs. And you are in charge in your Department of Education, so make it happen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mlabunguka. So a lot more clarity, a lot more focus, bringing our strengths into one arena instead of fragmenting into different directions. Prof. Sex, let me bring the question of greater efficiency gains that has been proposed in the report. And there are a number of measures that are mentioned. I'll list some of them. Better coordination and consolidation. We heard Liz speaking to that. Looking at some of these multiple pilot programs and consolidating in that regard so that we're really moving towards system-wide implementation. The use of data, for example, to really get to a point where we can target some of those resources. And finally, even improving accountability around teacher spending. The question to you, Prof, is, as you listen to this list of recommendations, are these the right measures you think are going to get us to the efficiency gains we're looking for? But maybe as an extension of that as well, are they enough? Especially when we hear that we're expecting a minimum of 1 million learners to join the system by 2030.
So many of them are the right things that we should be focusing on. They're important interventions, and most of us would agree that we should try and take these forward. But I think first we need to be clear that efficiency gains are not sufficient to offset fiscal consolidation.
Right.
And in any case, I mean, I'm a believer that in conditions of fiscal consolidation, that's the worst time to try and make efficiency gains, because you've got a demoralized, conflictual, and declining resource base, which is a situation where people kind of grab on to whatever last remaining cents they can. Efficiency gains are much better implemented in an expanding budget. They take time. It's like engaging in a process of structural reform. And they involve conflicts of interest. And if they do, I think, I mean, my general comment, I suppose, on the discussion this morning is that everything is couched as an intervention.
Yes.
And I know that, politicians like interventions because they generally follow, or following an intervention, you can cut a ribbon. Also, technical experts love interventions because they can sit in their university and apply their pointy heads to data and then tell you that this is what the evidence says, this is the intervention you need. The problem, and I'm not against interventions, they're necessary and they can make important improvements. But the thing we need to think about is not interventions, but institutions. The education system is a human system that reproduces itself. We need to ask, what is it about this system that continues to reproduce bad outcomes, particularly at the foundation phase? So instead of designing and executing interventions, I think we should be thinking about institutions and reforms to institutions. So for example, who is responsible in South Africa today for the reading budget?
Yeah.
The answer is nobody. There's nobody responsible for it. In fact, who is responsible for reading as an outcome in government? There's nobody. It's a concurrent function. There's not a budget for reading. There's not a budget for education, in fact. Everything is concurrent. Everybody decides together, and nobody can be held accountable.
Yeah.
So we need to look at reforms to our budget system, reforms to our education system that change the character of what the system produces, rather than interventions that are supposed to improve the current system without changing it fundamentally. And I think that long list of interventions that's been planned since 1994, but never scaled up, shows you that there's a fundamental problem here. The reason interventions are preferred to institutional change is that making interventions requires no trade-offs. It requires no difficult decisions. It requires no politics. It's simply a technical intervention that's not going to ruffle anyone's feathers. And I think if that's our starting point, we're going to continue repeating the same mistakes as in the past.
So, Prof, I want to stay with you for a moment. From interventions to institutions, I'm thinking of all the ribbon-cutting events I've been to now, and I feel like I've been on the wrong side of the fence there, Prof. But I want us to talk about a big issue that Liz put up on the screen. The issue of the spending on wages for teachers relative to other items that get spent on. And I'll take us to the report. The report says that what we are seeing is that the overall spending on learners is dwarfed by wages for teachers who are then not deployed equitably between schools. And the report then says maybe what we need to do is have, as a short-term solution, is to actually target resources to schools that serve children in poor communities. The question to you, Prof, is, do you think that proposal makes sense, just at a gut reaction level? And what suggestion might you put on the table on equitable financing in the system?
So the most important item in the education budget is teacher salaries. This is not money that is spent on teachers. This is the most important input into learning, is teaching. So the way the report kind of makes out that really what is at issue is the norms and standards funding, I think is entirely wrong, because actually it's post-provisioning, and the ability of the state to generate, mobilize and deploy its teachers is the central question in education, not whether you're allocating some small amounts of money to schools on an equitable basis. In any case, once you have a post-provisioning norm and you've allocated your teachers to learners, then presumably everything else should follow those teachers in the form of books and classrooms and blackboards. So really, this kind of thinking that dominates our discussion, not only in education but elsewhere, that somehow the salary bill is a waste of money. It gets thrown away somewhere and doesn't have any impact. And then how can we better design interventions around? How do we mobilize teachers? How do we ensure that they are teaching? How do we use that salary bill more effective? How do we allocate teachers to schools? How do we ensure that the best teachers are not hoarded in the private sector? I think those are the questions we have to ask.
And I know Permi is probably itching to respond to some of those suggestions you've put, but let me go to Yana first, because Yana, one of the things, or one of the threads that kept coming up this morning is public-private partnerships. Let's look at the example of where you sit, in particular with Apex Education. You have a partnership with the provincial department. You are really servicing children in low-income communities. Question to you is, how is this partnership really delivering access and quality of education to the poorest of learners? And to link it back to Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka, how might we scale this?
Thank you so much. So I think partnership with government is like any good marriage. You stay together for the benefit of the kids. And I think that's really why we still stick with it. I think from our side and from government side, everyone will tell you partnership is never always smooth sailing. It really does take a lot of work and a lot of effort and commitment to make something meaningful out of it. So at Apex, we partner with government in more than one way. Two of the models was mentioned today. The one is around the collaboration schools model, and then the other one is the low-cost independent schools, both in which we operate. So how does it benefit the child at the end of the day? I think there's many ways. The obvious one is resources. There's been a lot of conversation today about a resource-constrained environment in the public purse. We definitely see that on the ground. What I also see is a strong commitment and a willing sector who's willing to invest into education. I really think private sector sees the economic enabler that both the Honourable Minister and the delegates from the World Bank spoke about today. So there's a really strong commitment to invest into education. And of course, these resources allocated then really translate into benefits for children. So whether it's better books or teachers or training or buildings or infrastructure or computers or internet or security or whatever the outcome of that is, but it translates into meaningful improvements for children on the ground. Maybe just one practical example, but the independent school that we operate, because it operates within a strong existing framework of partnership where government subsidizes low-fee independent schools, we were able to secure private investment in, for instance, to pay for the build of the school. So that means then the government wouldn't have to build another school, because that's then funded by private money, but then government comes to the party and say, we'll partner on the subsidy. I think that another way that it benefits children is around innovation. I mean, government is a huge operation. So as a private operator, we're definitely able to test innovations and pilot and try new methodologies and document learnings and share those learnings. And then I think another way in which the children and ultimately the sector benefit is often at the bottom end of the income scale are left only to be cared for by the state. Sure. And by opening up that space to private providers, you really add another voice. You really add another data point, another institution who comes into that playing field and say, how do we really care for these children as best as possible and in the best way that they need, and really showing that it's possible.
So Yana, I want to stay in your reality a little bit, and thank you for sharing that with us, because the report then also points to some regulatory obstacles in terms of getting players like yourselves, private entities, into the system. On the one hand, the report also says, well, there are obstacles, but we also want private providers to have some degree of autonomy. And with that autonomy, we're also expecting some degree of accountability. And there are lots of moving pieces here, and I'm keen to hear, in your view, how do we get that balance right? How do we create this, open up the space for private providers to do similar work to what you're doing, more competition for you, of course, but also how do we do that with accountability in the system, even as you take on a posture of autonomy?
So the need is so big that any competition is welcome. I think the more people who could contribute, the better. But this dynamic between autonomy and accountability is one which I think as South Africa we have struggled with. Of course, we're learning and hopefully improving on it. But actually, I made a note from the report where it says the authorities would need to closely monitor these schools by designing results indicators, and then for payments to be tied to the achievement of results and regular auditing. And I think in that is the key, is not to regulate necessarily how you do it or what your ideas are, but to say, these are the outcomes we want, these are the outcomes we want, these are the clear results we need, and if you're able to deliver that, then it works for us. I think it's been an area in which there's been a lot of uncertainty. There hasn't been so much clarity around what the actual results are that we're trying to achieve. Yeah. If you ask me, I'll say it's children first, like you mentioned. Like we have to say, if you can deliver the following results for the following children, then that's a success. In the absence of that, it starts becoming vague, and I think then it creates this stifled environment that you refer to.
And so on the note of results, I want to come to you, Permi, with that, because ultimately we want to see positive learning outcomes in the classroom. If we go back to both the video that Liz shared, but also the report, it tells us that the big differentiator is going to be what's actually taught in the classroom and how it's taught. It's the pedagogy more than anything else. One of the things that are highlighted is one-on-one coaching within the classroom. And it's just a very simplistic question to you is, what is the profile of an ideal coach, and do such profiles actually exist within the education system? And as I hand over to you, I'm thinking again of Dr. Mlambo saying, when the teacher gets into the classroom, what is the kind of support then that is available to them to do the best that they can do in the teaching and learning space?
Okay, so you had said, I was itching to respond.
I could tell.
Sorry. Michael said there's nobody at the national for championing or accountability for reading. I nominate you. Because right now what you're talking to is really making a change within the system, which is one thing that I really I advocate for as well. But to get back to your answer, the ideal coach, okay, Chum. In my experience, an ideal coach is a coach who has a deep understanding of content and also the pedagogy. So what am I teaching and how is this supposed to be taught? And the reason for this is because when the coach is in the classroom, they need to be able to identify the gaps and target those specific gaps to assist the teacher. And sometimes this means they have to demonstrate, and sometimes it means they have to co-teach. So they must really know their story. The second one is it's ideal if they have classroom experience in a similar context, because now they're not talking dreaming things. They know what the challenges teachers experience, right? The third is they need to have strong communication and coaching abilities, because now we're talking to somebody who's trying to guide you and give you constructive feedback to change your practice. And I mean, I think if we're all human beings in the room, we know how difficult changing is, right? So it talks to that task then of having this strong communication so that a teacher still feels motivated to try in the difficulty of trying to change your practice. And then I think lastly, it's around being adaptable. Yes. Because it's not like you come in and all teachers are the same and they need the same type of support. So when you walk into this classroom, you must be able to talk to the context of that classroom and the needs of that particular teacher, because support doesn't look the same for a teacher who's at this level compared to a teacher who's at this level.
But Permi, what about the inspectors? Aren't they the ones who are supposed to be doing this? Or the subject advisors? Are we just adding another role, another body in the classroom?
So the subject advisor's role is very much on the compliance bit. Are you covering the content, and also the ratio of a subject advisor coming to actually see you in the classroom is very low. Now, firstly, that kind of a conversation where I'm checking if you're complying is different to a coaching conversation where I'm helping you with a growth mindset. Where do we move from here to better your practice next, right? Yeah. So it's the relationship, and also it's the practicality of how often can a subject advisor come to see you and support you compared to a coach.
So, final question, and then I'm going to take one or two comments from the audience before we wrap. I want to come to you on the question of assessments. We saw that as a prominent part of the conversation. We know that since 2015, I think, we no longer have the honors that tested every learner where we are now is a sample-based assessment approach. So tell us about how Funda Wande brings assessment into the system a lot more regularly, and how do these assessments really help to bolster the outcomes around reading and mathematics?
Okay, so I'll just, because Funda Wande works with different interventions designed in different ways, I'll zone in.
I'm a bit worried about using the word interventions now.
Okay,
After.
we're still there. We'll look at changing ways. I'll zone in on the coaching intervention.
Yes.
And that one is in the Eastern Cape. And that's designed to actually change teacher practice. So what we do in that intervention, we use EGRAs to, as a baseline for a teacher to say, this is a snapshot at the beginning of the year, this is where my learners are, and in what they can achieve, putting them in groups and targeting those specific groups with what they need on the reading ladder, right? And so what happens is, then there's a constant ongoing conversation with the teachers and with the learners and how they're performing. So those results are not just to give to someone else, they to inform my daily instructions to that group, and then at the end of the term or beginning of the next term, we take another EGRA to see, have they progressed? And now what I really like about these conversations is that, firstly, it builds accountability because this is a conversation that's had as a whole school, one, and so you're also able to work together, brainstorm, find out what are other strategies that people are using that are efficient. So the beauty of it is that it's not for someone else. It's for me and to inform me and to help track the progress of my learners. So that's what I can say.
I think it's a beautiful segue, thanks Permi, for us just to see if there's any, I'm happy to take questions, but also if you just have a comment and you just want to step into the conversation with your own reaction, reflection and insights, I'm happy to do that. I know that Liz and Jacques are still in the room and they have a roving mic somewhere, so that if you want to put a question to them in particular, they're also able to take that question. Do I have any comments, any hands for, yes please sir, can I get a microphone there? Liz, I feel like I would like you to come and take the seat here so that we can put a question to you. I'm happy to stand. Please come and take a seat. Do I have another one after the gentleman so we can see? Okay, so we're going to go that side of the room and then take this side of the room and then we're going to wrap. Sir, if you could please just introduce yourself and then please ask your question.
I'm Dr. Mtembu from the Department of Basic Education. I'm DDG for Curriculum Policy Monitoring Support. I think I just want first to thank the panelists for the insight they are bringing into this platform, and also agree with them in most of what they are saying. But I just want to make two comments because of time constraints. The first one is assessment.
Yes.
To say the system is assessing. The only thing is that assessment now, you see, you cannot grow your pig by weighing it every day. You have to feed it. So there must be more teaching and learning, and then assessment as well. So I think there's already an overkill of assessment in the system, because the teacher must assess formatively. There must be formative assessment, and there must be individual assessment as learners go home to look at their coverage. There should be also a summative assessment, and we have also these benchmarks, and we have also our own systemic assessments. I think it's the quality of assessment that we need to improve, so that learners, when we assess knowledge, comprehension, and application. That's the first comment. I'm not asking a question. The other one is that of the subject advisors. Yes, there were times when they were called inspectors at that time. They wanted to know how much have you covered. But things have changed with the CAPS curriculum. Now the emphasis is on both coverage and outcomes.
Yes.
So we have moved away from the calendar closure to an outcomes closure because of the assessment that must ensure. And the curriculum then is written in that sense. But I do agree with the panelists that the coach is very important in this scenario. But I think in trying to ensure that we have another layer in terms of coaching, we have these people who are called departmental heads. That is the subject advisor closest to the teacher, and the subject advisor on site. Maybe we can question the role of the other one who is not on site. But the idea is to say, why do you, if you have a 4-year training as a teacher, why do you need a subject advisor after 10 years of teaching? You get the point. You are well trained. So what I'm trying to say then is that there are things that we need to discuss to refine these issues so that at the end of the day, we improve quality, but also close those gaps which we, as people in education, find as needing more, not interventions, but support.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mthembu. You can't grow a pig by weighing it every day. That is certainly going to be one of the sound bites that I'm going to be taking away. I want to take all the questions and comments, and then as a closing comment, give you an opportunity to react to the ones that stand out the most. I think I have a hand here. Please, please go ahead. I have a few hands here, so let's make them sharp and short and concise. Please go ahead.
Cool. Thank you very much. My name is Mahfouz. I'm from Equal Education. And appreciate much of the work that has gone into the report. I think the finding in particular on how we are spending more on quintile 1, 4 and 5 schools than on no-fee schools is really damning. And I think that's from the Western Cape in particular as well. But I'm also worried about certain trends in this report. This seems to have this almost the classic World Bank IMF structural adjustment policy recommendations that, you know, cut spending, bring in privatization, and we've seen over history how this has failed, particularly African states. So just worried about the nuances there, what regulations are important, what ways to ensure that equitability is really protected, especially in the context of South Africa's obscene inequality. It also, like, around the question of introducing and incentivizing private partners, it's kind of ignores the evidence from around the world about the threats of privatization and paints it as these random fears that people have rather than drawing like evidence-backed concerns about its implications for equity in education particularly. And then there's this weird thing. It says education is an investment, it has excellent returns, and government can't spend more because government's not getting good returns. So there's kind of a paradox there. So it says government must not spend more on education, even though education is a very important investment. That seems a bit circular.
Mahfouz, I'm going to ask you just
last one.
Yeah, because let's do a final one in the last 10 seconds.
Also, a lot of it is based on a report and research similar done for the Western Cape in particular, and it doesn't seem to cover the rest of South Africa as much. And the Western Cape is very unique relative to other provinces. So just wondering if there's an intention to expand that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think there are a couple of things for you, Liz, as you listen in. I'm going to take one more. So I've taken one from this table. There was a hand at this table, this gentleman, and then we'll go back to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Stephen Taylor from the DBE. The report spoke a bit about the quintile system, and it seemed that it was really becoming more of a binary system between fee-paying schools and non-fee-paying schools now in effect. And I wonder if the panelists would...
Stephen, can I just ask you a bit closer so they
Sure.
can hear you?
I wonder if the panelists would agree with me that the core challenge in South Africa is improving the quality of teaching and learning in the non-fee-paying section of the system. And if that's the case, you highlighted some of the disparities in spending on teachers, where we're spending actually a little bit more on fee-paying schools. But if fee-paying schools are a small fraction of the system, I think sort of 10 to 15%, how much scope is there really to more effectively to redistribute that? So if we, for instance, did something where we shifted the learner-educator ratio in fee-paying schools from, say, 30 to 1 to, say, 35 to 1, what kind of change would that make to no-fee schools in reality? And linked to that, Michael's point about 80% of spending is on teachers. And so you're saying these other interventions are kind of a bit of a sideshow. And if I'm suggesting, actually implicit in my question, that there's not much scope to redeploy teachers from fee-paying schools to non-fee-paying schools and make a substantial change through that, surely the World Bank reports kind of recommendations of improving things like teacher professional accountability in the non-fee-paying schools, I mean in the entire system, in a sense, if we regard interventions not so much as things on the side that are not seen as through teachers, but if we regard interventions as maybe efficient sort of boosts to improve the quality of learning and teaching, to improve what we get out of the 80% of what we spend, which is on teachers, would that not be a sort of a way to deliver system-wide strengthening? I would 100% agree with you that if we define interventions as kind of short-term, things that happen in 500 or 1,000 schools, these kind of one-off projects, then it's possibly a waste of time. But shouldn't we be thinking of them as ways to deliver the kind of institutional change on a system-wide level that you envisage?
Stephen, I'm going to pause you there. Thank you very much. So thank you to the floor. Mary, I see you. I'm going to get in too much trouble. I left 3 hands behind me. So I'm going to come back to the panel if you'll have me. But I also understand that we've got refreshments in the next room, so we'll be able to continue the conversation a little bit more. There's lots to react to in this final comment, and I'm going to ask us to be concise as we do that. So I'm going to just work my way systematically. So Dr. Mlambunguka, as I start off with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we need to be focusing on is the quality of assessment and not the quantity of assessments, which is what I've heard from Dr. Mthembu. And also, I think it was Mafuzu was saying, have we lost sight of the lessons of the threat of, if everything is super privatized, do we miss the moral incentive? So should we be giving Yana and her competitors?
I think that, for us at the reading panel, we are focused on ensuring that children can read for meaning by the time they read grade 4, which is about 10 years old, and that we address all children, and especially the children who are in no-fee school. And all these bits and pieces that as you are raising them, I almost feel that we need to think about how we could reimagine education, how we could restructure the education system as it is today. I can't get my head around everything, but I just feel like there's a need to revise and to reform everything in order for all the different pieces to hang together. Because right now we have different mechanisms that evaluate. We also have different platforms that assess the performance of our children in South Africa, but we just don't have one method that keeps everything going. So I think for me, it's consolidation and it's the review of the education system so that we emerge with something that we want to be. Because what we were training children for in 1994, in 2000, and the children now, totally different. We really have to rethink education from 0 to higher education. So much change that is needed. Otherwise, it's just bits and pieces that we're doing.
So consolidation and more consolidation as we think about the strategic reform. Michael, this question from Stephen is, from the way that Stephen is seeing it, he's like, well, what if all of these interventions were like boosters that allow us to unlock more value from the spend on teachers? What's your reaction to that?
So I think one of the great achievements of the democratic education system has been to keep the middle class in the public system.
And so when the World Bank is showing us data where we have such a small private sector in education, they're actually showing us the result of our important victory, which is keeping people who can pay fees in the public system. I don't accept that there can be no more redistribution within that public system. At the center of the challenge in the education system is redistribution of real resources within the education system. Why can't the state deploy teachers to where it wants them to go? Why do we have an entirely voluntary, privately run teaching market? Why can't the state regulate that and decide? But the real imbalance in the system is okay, there's this imbalance between, so I want to, in a sense, respond to the fellow from Equal Education, that indeed a movement that says, let the private sector bring additional resources onto the table, and then it will free the public sector to target its scarce resources at the poorest of the poor, is a recipe for a complete failure of an education system. Because those targeted resources that go into ghetto schools are going to degrade and worsen as they have been doing over the last 30 years. So you have to create a single system. Okay, that's one issue. The second big issue is foundation phase. So at the moment, there is no assessment there's an assessment, there is one assessment in education that is salient, that is important. It's called the matric. The MEC for Education is not held accountable by anyone for outcomes in reading. I'm sure he cares about it a lot, and I'm sure there's a lot of discussions in government, but political accountability for the MEC for Education is about the matric exam. And so we have to ask, who is assessment for and what is assessment for? For me, assessment is for parents.
Sure.
And if the assessment is not getting to the parents, it's not having any impact. And so I would say, how do you shift teachers? I'm told at WITS, I don't know if it's true everywhere else, but people who can't get into economics are told to apply to become teachers. And now I can tell you, WITS is struggling to teach economics. Not sure how it's doing in teaching teachers. But the less capable teachers or students go to teach foundation phase. And the more capable teachers go to teach matric and the senior phases. How do you change those incentives and redeploy teachers towards where they're really needed at the foundations phase? And again, you need institutional reform, change in assessment methods, etc.
Thank you so much, Pop. I'm so mindful that there are people with diaries and that need to move. So I'm going to be asking you ladies to be really tight on this. Yana, I'm going to be super unfair and just say to you, why is the private sector the boogeyman in this conversation? How do we make sure that we don't land, as Prof has said, in a complete disintegration of the system if the private sector starts saying, the government spending needs to be just focused on the poorest of the poor. What are your thoughts on that part of the conversation?
Difficult question. I think the one obvious thing is that in education, the bulk of the burden is always going to lie with the state. I don't think in a country like ours, private sector is ever going to take the responsibility away from the state or, compete in any way. I mean, I think the numbers they showed was 5.5% enrollment in private institutions. But we're not only talking about necessarily private schooling.
Yes.
The question is there a role for private sector to play in supporting the government in delivering on this mandate? And I think absolutely yes. Yeah. The question at the end of the day for me has always been, regardless of what the governance models are or the operating vehicles or whatever, is what is it that we ultimately want? And we want children who can read and write and count fluently and ultimately progress into a life of adulthood with dignity. And to think that the state is the only people who can fulfill that, I think might be ignorant. So I do think there's value that the independent sector can play and add to that.
Thank you very much. Let me then just come to you, Permi. I think Dr. Mthembu said, what about the person who's not on site but has an assessment responsibility? And he says, look, if we look at subject advisors, you know, they are not only doing coverage in terms of assessments, they're also looking at outcomes. A quick reaction to that question. Or comment.
What I'd really like to react to is the part he mentioned around departmental heads.
Yes.
Which, I mean, I was excited about talking about how do we embed things in the system. And what we're trying to do with the lessons that we're getting from coaching is see how do we embed those into the system. So how do we use departmental heads, lead teachers, etc. And what I've seen is that there are a couple of organizations who have coaching courses now. Because if you're going through a degree, you don't get a coaching course as a teacher, right? And so that helps equip the teachers, the lead teachers and HODs in actually getting this right. And Fundawande is actually doing some of that with Rhodes University, just as a side info. And I think what is interesting now is trying to see what impact does that really have in the classroom. And I think the last bit is also to understand the people we're talking about actually have full-time jobs, right? And we're expecting them to then, on top of that, do a constant supporting of teachers. And there's a question mark around that, but I also think there's a thinking that we need to think, how do we do this differently? It might not look like what it looks like now, but if we're saying coaching actually works and we want to improve the quality of teaching, what needs to happen for the departmental heads and the lead teachers to be able to take this task on?
Thank you very much, Permi. So as I'm standing here in the corner, Liz, I'm noticing you've got quite a number of notes that you've put down. So I'm going to give you just a minute just to respond to some of the salient comments and questions that have come from the floor in regards to the report.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify that the report doesn't say that we should cut spending on education. It says that there is in real terms, the budget has gone down.
Yeah.
And it's a very difficult fiscal situation, and it's unlikely that that increase is going to happen very rapidly, right? The growth is starting to take off, but that's what we see. The last year has been a 10 billion Rand decline in the budget in real terms. So just to clarify that. And also in terms of the engagement with the private sector, I think it's also being quite cautious around building that system capacity to regulate of the private sector. So we talk about accountability and we talk about autonomy. And they have to go hand in hand. In order to have accountability, you need to have good results that can be measured and indicators that are measurable, but you also need to have indicators that can't be gamed in the system, right? So that requires having a state that has capacity to regulate. So it's going to be an iterative process. You started small in South Africa, and it's trying to experiment and see what works for your system. This is not about the private. You cannot, in education, have a private sector running the entire system. We saw what happened in other countries like Liberia when that did happen. So that's not the case at all that we're pushing for. And just last question to respond to Stephen's question. What we were showing was just the status quo. The status quo is that within teachers, most teachers currently are attracted because it's a very market-based system and the school governing bodies are hiring and you're applying to schools. The most qualified or experienced teachers are going into quintile 5. So how do you change that? Through professional accountability, through better initial training of teachers, and setting standards to make sure that when teachers go into the system, they come in with the minimum qualifications, they get the practical training, they spend time on reading instruction. We were told recently by one of the researchers at UCT, looking at one of the higher education institutions doing teacher training, that less than 5% of their time, this is foundational level teachers, is spent teaching on the practice of teaching the teachers how to give reading instruction.
Sure.
That needs to change to much higher. And I think that's the system change that hopefully will help resources, better resources, teaching resources get to quintile 1 to 3 schools. So it's not about or shifting or reallocating. It's about thinking about the future and the system of incoming teachers.
Liz, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask for a big round of applause for our panelists, please? And Just as I release them, allow me just to say just this one thing. Satu, I think it's clear. We need more time. We need more conversational opportunities. There's, I think, a lot of input that would have come not only from the panel, but from the floor. But this certainly is an extremely important contribution to the policy debate. Thank you for creating the space. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nozipho Shabalala. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Happy to see. I'm sure. You're fine.